Good evening and welcome to the March 28th meeting of the Gaithersburg Planning Commission. It's a postponed meeting from the 21st. So if you're keeping score on our first and third Wednesdays, we had to postpone last week because of the weather. So it's the same agenda that was published for last week. First up is the, I guess we don't have minutes from our previous meeting yet. Okay. First up then is a consent item. The consent agenda, there's one item for AFP 7826-2016. Fence approval at 220 Forest Preserve Drive in the mixed-use development MXD zone. Any questions on the consent agenda? All right, is there a motion, please?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we accept the consent item AFP 7826-2018 is read into the record.
Second.
It's moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. All right, that takes us then to our one item tonight on the discussion agenda, and that's for a recommendation to the Mayor and City Council for STP 7712-2017 Kentlands Square Infill Sites, part of Parcel L Block Q in the MXD zone. And this is for the addition of 16,000 square feet of commercial and minor site changes, including a revised drive-through layout. And it's a schematic, an STP Schematic Development Plan recommendation to council. So presenting from staff is Kirk Eby. Good evening, Kirk.
Good evening. Thank you, members of the Commission, and good evening. This is the follow-up Planning Commission recommendation for Schematic Development Plan application SDP-7712-2017. As you recall, the application proposes to construct 3 additional commercial infill buildings totaling 16,000 square feet along the private drive aisle connecting Kentlands Boulevard and Main Street within the Kentlands Square Shopping Center, along with some minor site changes. The southernmost Site E includes a proposed drive-through, which is the focus of this follow-up recommendation. During its December 6, 2017 meeting, the Commission supported the inclusion of a drive-through, noting that it was an appropriate amenity for the shopping center. The Commission recommended approval of the plan and added a third condition requiring, prior to the final site plan, any final site plan approval, that the applicant reconfigure the drive-through so that the drive lane for the drive-through would not cross any sidewalks. At the January 16, 2018 Mayor and City Council policy discussion, the Council discussed the third condition and expressed a desire to see the actual revised drive-through layout. Council then voted to reopen its record and allow the applicant to provide additional information about how the drive-through would be reconfigured. The Planning Commission reopened its record the following day on January 17, 2018. So because the Council did not take final action at its January meeting, the plan is following the review process under Section 24-198, parenthesis C2II, which allows the plan to be revised prior to final action by the Council. Such a revised plan must be resubmitted to the Planning Commission for further review and recommendation, followed by another policy discussion by the Mayor and City Council. On February 20th, 2018, the applicant submitted a revised site plan that altered the drive-through lane so that it does not cross any sidewalks. The revised plan with the alternate drive-through layout is, again, the focus of this follow-up recommendation. The Planning Commission's record on SDP 7712-2017 reclosed at 5 p.m. on March 9th, 2018, and at the time of that record reclosing, there were 82 exhibits in the record, or in the Commission's record.
Yes.
I'd now like to direct you to the map that's hopefully going to come up on the screen here in a minute and orient you back to the site. It's a 1.8 acre site within the Kentlands Square Shopping Center on the Lowe's portion of that shopping center between the Mattress Firm on Kentlands Boulevard and the Chipotle Cold Stone building on Main Street. Site E and the associated drive-through are located at the southern end of the project area near the Mattress Firm building. And I'll actually switch to the site plan just so you can see. This is the Site E. And walking through the changes in the revised plan, again, the drive-through has been reconfigured. It now begins and ends in this secondary drive aisle that connects, or that provides connection between the existing entrance here and the one entrance that's proposed between sites C and D. And of course, it no longer crosses the sidewalk here along the main drive aisle access into the shopping center. And this secondary drive aisle was also shown in the initial plan. So it's really just, again, a reconfiguration of this area around the Site E and the drive-through. The build-to line for Site E has also been changed, so it's now reoriented to line up with with a longer face lining up with the other buildings along the drive aisle. And that creates a stronger street wall along the entrance driveway. The convenience parking next to Site E, which is along here, that has remained, so there's still an accessible space potentially right there as well next to the building. And these parking spaces can be accessed by pedestrians without having to cross the drive-through as well. The redesign also maintains a connectivity between Site E and Site D, and it still allows opportunities for outdoor seating and other amenities adjacent, in between the building and the drive aisle, and also between the two building sites as well. Staff is supportive of the changes to the drive-through layout, and we reaffirm our support for the application as a whole, and we have provided comprehensive findings in the supplemental staff analysis.
Nicely done, by the way.
Thank you. So staff does recommend the Planning Commission, based upon the evidence and testimony submitted into the record and the findings presented in the supplemental staff analysis, recommend approval of Schematic Development Plan SDP 7712-2017 to the Mayor and City Council with 2 conditions that are included in the staff analysis. The third condition that the Commission had added previously, staff has left that out because we feel that this plan meets the spirit of that condition, so it's no longer needed. And staff is available to answer questions, and there are members of the applicant's team here as well if you need any clarifications.
Sounds good. And to remind everybody, the record's closed, so we won't be
Yes.
hearing any additional testimony, only question and answer. Can you, I think I understand condition 2, but after condition 2, but after I read it a couple of times, I started to wonder if I understood it correctly. Does that mean then that the infrastructure, the pedestrian infrastructure, doesn't have to go in until building 2 is permitted, or final site plan comes in?
That is the intention. So it was.
But why is that? Why
so
would-
it was kind of a balance from that staff had suggested, rather than if the applicant came in with just one building, for example, rather than having to do all those improvements at that one time, we felt it was fair to say that it had to be 2 of the 3 in order to trigger that entire improvement.
Right, but I
Because it
thought
depends on where the building goes. Like if Site C came in first, for example,
Yeah.
then you'd have a continuation from the existing Chipotle, and then we felt that it would be fine to have it sort of stop there. Certainly if Site E came in first, that might change. That might be a little weird to have this connection but then have a missing link. But again, we felt it was fair to sort of require 2 of the 3 to be approved first.
Okay, because all right, well, that'd be good for discussion, but that's the intent, is that
That was the intent,
doesn't
correct.
trigger the streetscape work until building 2 is approved, or site plan comes in for building,
Mhm.
whichever second line is in, right?
Correct.
And of course, if 2 come in together, then the whole thing goes, but,
Correct.
all right, any questions for Kurt on the presentation or recommendation?
So,
Phil, you look like you're kind of gearing up there to.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask quick, just clarification.
Mhm.
So you're saying the space between Site C and Chipotle, that's already got, I noticed from the sketch plan, it's already got a patio, if you will, or some kind of, whatever you call it, paseo, whatever you want to call it, between them, between Chipotle and C. But between E and D, there is no,
Right, they're not. The applicant's not showing a similar.
Right.
So what you're referring to, if I can figure out how
Go
to
back
zoom
to-
in, let's
yeah.
see if we can get in here.
right, there you go.
So what you're referring to is the applicant is showing that there could be a proposed sort of patio
Patio,
or
right,
plaza in
exactly.
between Site C and the existing Site E where the Chipotle is. They haven't shown that here.
Right.
It could just be that they were doing this quickly. I mean, at final site plan, certainly they will show more
Okay.
detail about what's happening. It may be that they also are waiting to see how exactly these buildings work.
Well,
Because
right,
remember,
and-
these are built 2 lines, so depending on
listen,
how
as a-
they're actually.
As a practical matter,
Located.
if you're encouraging pedestrian access between the buildings, which is an okay thing to do, it's not ideal there with the way the orientation of the trash receptacles and
Oh,
the drive-through were configured. You may not actually want to encourage folks to walk back
Gotcha.
there and then get hung up in what's happening around that drive-through. It's a downside to that one particular passage, but you've got others along the way, so.
Okay, that was all, I just want clarification on
That's
this.
fair, yeah, sure.
I guess the one thing, and I know this has come up in semi-excruciating detail at every time we've discussed this, but reading through pretty much all of the public comments, I think it bears getting yet again a clarification from staff on, and that is sort of the legal position we're in relative to the 2008 master plan versus the previously approved, plan for the site, and what we are as a commission bound to review it against. Because I think many of us up here, as well as many of the people in the public, would love to review this against the 2008 master plan and use that as the governing document, but clearly that's not what we're required to do, so I think it would be helpful to get some clarification on that.
Right, and Frank, jump in at any time if he wants to help me out here. There is actually a memo in your packet that speaks to this directly. So basically it has to do with property rights, investing, and again, Frank can clarify this better than I can, but basically because this plan was approved under a former master plan and a former sketch plan in SDP, those still apply until the applicant decides to implement the newer master plan, the 2008 master plan, whole scale, right? So essentially, you're reviewing this then against I think it's the 1998 or 1988 master plan for Kentlands, which showed a village center, and this was part of that village center in the commercial area of Kentlands. And then there's a associated sketch plan with that, and then this is really an SDP under that initial sketch plan. Staff did note that looking at the 2008 master plan, that master plan did envision these short-term, interim conditions happening, and so staff does feel this meets the spirit of that as well as the 2008 master plan, even though you're not really reviewing it against that particular master plan. I think it definitely helps that it is still meeting the spirit of that in terms of the long-term redevelopment. And as we've pointed out, and as the applicant has pointed out, these infill sites will not preclude the long-term redevelopment of this particular area within the shopping center. The applicant also indicated this would probably be the last of the area to redevelop due to the back end stuff that's going on with the shopping center. So.
Can I just clarify? I think
Sure.
that what the clarification from staff came in terms of it complying with the master plan as it refers to a sketch that is shown, but when it is actually broken down in detail, the document that represents the master plan speaks against development there and recommends that to be a secondary street.
The 2008 master plan.
The 2008 master plan. So the actual document, it's the way I see it is in contradiction. There are some sketches that support the vision, but that is not the ultimate full description that is obtained in the document.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't want to speak for the other commissioners, but having had this discussion at multiple points before, I think, and for the public's sake, I think personally I would love to stick more towards the 2008 master plan, but I just want everybody to understand that we don't really have that as an option, and I'm assuming there are potential consequences for the city if somehow the mayor and council and our commission decided to say, the heck with it, we want what we want.
Right.
Well,
As he pointed out, that you're dealing with the constitutional vested rights that accrue when you have prior approved plans. Yes, the 2008 master plan may have a different vision, at least long-term, but again, we're still working with the prior plans that are already in place.
I struggle with the same notion. I think specifically because it just feels like, it's a recommendation that is rubber stamp and that I don't know, it gives me pause because I seem to not have control as a board or as a commissioner to work within any parameters, but to enable it to go. But I think if we look at our responsibilities as the planning commission, our responsibilities is to look at the plans that are being proposed within a context, and the concept being the larger community. And I think first and foremost, we have to maintain and understand the applicant's interest in the market that is beyond Kentlands, and that they have a catchment that extends outside many miles probably. But I think it's also like worth understanding where we got here. And I think that if we look at where this pad size came from, it came from a code adjustment where the parking dimensions was reduced, and so Seoul had the opportunity of having open developable area. And I think, you know, looking at their site, it makes sense that they would consider this location. However, looking at it in a greater context, it does give me some past task. And so I think, you know, I have some challenges in the way that the way that this current proposal addresses the circulation in the site, and it gives me pause in terms of the stacking. It moves to a different direction, but it also keeps coming back to the fact that there's a collective vision that was agreed upon within the city, the community, Seoul Center, Kimco, and all the parties came together and spent a great deal of taxpayer money towards creating a vision that we're somehow steer away legally from just complying with. So I've met with staff, I've looked at the options, and I actually do believe that after all of those discussions, there is the possibility that us as a commission would consider encouraging the applicant and looking at the public comment, which is looking at everything in comment and in context, and considering a solution that addresses those concerns. And from that standpoint, we have got enough support or enough feedback from the community that of the desire of them to work with that. So based on that feedback that we have obtained, I think it behooves us to encourage the applicant to work in a solution that don't necessarily follow strictly the master plan, but that it comes to a way, or perhaps considers a way in which those could be married, or there will be a solution. And I don't think that is outside of our legal responsibilities, because we're not approving or denying, we're just making a recommendation that in spite of their efforts that sadly I don't think meet this, I don't think are ideal for the, it's not an ideal proposal, that they would hopefully go back to the drawing board and consider incorporating some of the designs that could potentially create a scenario that is more acceptable for the community.
Fair enough. What I was struggling with on a lot of the public comment was there was for and against, but not really a lot. There was some, but not a lot in terms of what criteria should be used to judge and grade what gets done there.
And that's where I'm coming from, is saying, you know, we have some guidance. Let's not ignore the vision that was put together by the community and by the people.
Well, I'm not sure that we are. I mean,
let's just say, is there any way that we can encourage the applicant to work towards something like that?
But toward what? I mean, that's what I've been struggling with. I don't know what the what is, because the master plan doesn't really spell out a specific solution. They've presented a specific solution, but it does envision a level of density and a level of development that's not proposed here. I get that, I understand that, and a pattern essentially for development that doesn't exist here. We are frankly, I've got to, as we sit here and organize this discussion, be very clear that we have an approved sketch plan. And unless and until they deviate from that in a substantial way, interestingly enough, if they deviate from it in a substantial way, Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, then it would call into question what complies with the master plan or not, and then we would have that door would open essentially for a discussion about whether this is an appropriate project for the site. So we inherit a sketch plan that essentially describes a level of density and a specific pattern for how the street would develop along here, and what we're hung with is the potential that if it hadn't come in as a drive-through proposal, we probably would have had very little else to discuss. It would have moved through, I think, a fairly straightforward kind of a concurrence that it aligned with the sketch plan, and then the SDP could move forward on the mayor and council's approval or at their discretion. So the interesting thing to me is that we have come a ways in trying to solve for what effectively is not the master plan from 2008, but certainly a much better version of what the sketch plan originally proposed. You know, we get the pedestrian connection, we get a lot of the things going on that we've stated as our objectives. So take it back to the first point. I understand why people are against it. I understand that the testimony against it not complying with the larger vision that came out in the later master plan. I also understand the academic argument that a drive-through is not a part of what promotes a walkable community. When I back up and look at it and think, well, on the other hand, the plan itself, and our job is to direct development that does those things, that promotes a walkable development, that promotes a viable business community, that promotes smart land use, that does all of the things that are sort of spelled out in the criteria for, you know, you get into 24-172, and it's about compatibility, it's about, you know, all those things. And one of the things I have to at least give credit to this process and the applicant and staff is, so now we've come up with a pattern for development that includes a drive-through that doesn't compromise the pedestrian access. Right. I mean, that's what's really interesting to me in this conversation, is that up to this point, the drive-through was essentially a hindrance or a compromise to promoting walkable communities. Now what we're saying is it's essentially followed the true traditional town development, where all that service stuff happens out back. You know, it's in the back parking lot, and you don't. It's not a part of the public street. It's not a part of the streetscape. It's not a part of the public realm. It's part of that sort of back service area, which, by the way, in my opinion, is very consistent with what we're promoting in the residential development, which is to push the alleys or the views to the back of the house where the garages and the, you know, trash collection and the, you know, all those things happen that you don't want on the street. So it's an interesting conflict for me too, because if you take away, if you go to the sort of the last point I think is in play, which is the type of business that would want to drive through and whether or not that's compatible, we have less control or less to say about that, because basically food and retail and all that is all bundled together. So it could be, legally speaking, the drive-through could be a bank, it could be a McDonald's, it could be a dry cleaner, it could be all these different things, some of which we've already agreed are good for the neighborhood, right? We have banks, we have pharmacies, we have, you know, so these things are happening. So it's a little bit of a conflict to say that, I mean, we have to be perfectly frank. If we don't want fast food restaurant drive-throughs in that development, let's just say it. I mean, that's frankly what we've been reluctant to have drive-throughs. Right. If we don't want them to conflict with promoting a walkable community, I think we've gotten to a solution that's remarkably close to solving that problem, if not completely solving that problem. I wouldn't necessarily want to carbon copy and duplicate this everywhere, but it's an interesting challenge we put back on the applicant to actually solve for what we said our major objective was, which was to build the streetscape up and do something right with it, and ultimately create a viable streetscape that ultimately could then redevelop. Because I think one of the things this will help do is establish a pattern there that then allows the next phase to happen. Maybe, if the market's strong, and if everything we understand about retail doesn't come true, right, and the master plan doesn't really reflect what a market will support, you know, 20 years from now, it's all sort of hollow discussion anyway, because a lot of this has to be borne out by what a demand and what the neighborhood will want ultimately. So I'm having, I guess my conflict is I want to respect the people who spoke very knowledgeably and very thoroughly about why this is not a good idea, while being very clear that we are obliged legally, not on the guidance side, but certainly legally, to support an approved sketch plan that's already on record and basically vests property rights on the applicant. And so the only question on the table about that is, has anything happened that has substantially changed it? And I think staff made the argument months ago and convinced, you know, appropriately. No, it doesn't really fly in the face of what the approved sketch plan, the approved sketch plan established for properties. And really the only glitch in all this was the revision to a drive-through. So if there's compelling reason not to approve the drive-throughs, I don't want to see a compelling reason not to approve the site plan, the SDP recommendation based on the sketch plan, just to be clear. If there's a compelling reason not to approve the drive-through, that's what we think we need to get on the table for a recommendation to the mayor and council. The trouble I'm having with that conversation is again, since we laid out some very specific criteria which had to do with conflict with the pedestrian-oriented development and promoting a walkable community, the drive-through frankly doesn't figure into that anymore. At least, you know, not in a measurable way that I can see.
I mean, and while I agree with everything that it's been said, I also believe that there is, we do have the power, the way that I understand it, to encourage the applicant to find a solution based on the amount of feedback that we've received.
But that's my point. I don't get from the feedback.
There's not a solution. But
I don't even get a criteria or an objective from that.
But whether there's an objective or not, they're opposing this configuration. And so I believe that in any like reasonable, sensible approach, the proper way to do it is to go back to the drawing board and come up with a solution that like meets those concerns. And I think that there is
That's
a
my
way.
point.
You know,
I don't know what the concerns are. I'm trying to get on the table right now is what would the concerns be about moving forward? You know, what would this do? So if you look at our kind of criteria for approving things, and we're not approving this, so
it's a recommendation.
but let's assume we're at least basing it on the criteria we'd use to approve a site plan, because it will ultimately come back that way, right? Those criteria have to do with compatibility, have to do with consistency with an approved plan or a master plan. It has all these sort of objectives. And I don't know what the grounds would be for not moving it forward. That's what I'm really
because
struggling with.
I personally believe that there's other solutions to it. There's other solutions to allocate the square footage that they're proposing that support the general vision of the community.
But it may not support the market. It may not be a viable solution for their business.
But it behooves us to have take that feedback and encourage them to look into that and just come back and say it
So would
doesn't
the
work.
question be, have they looked at other things? I mean, I guess, are you asking that question, or?
Perhaps, I think we could.
That's a fair question.
Right.
I mean, here's my sort of fundamental struggle, and it's not limited to just this project, but in all of these, there is frankly, in my opinion, a limit in a privately owned commercial development to what the community gets to choose. We have guidelines, we have plans that are,
Right.
part of our municipal governance.
Yes.
And the community absolutely has a right to voice their opinions and provide input, and it behooves applicants to work with the community. But at the end of the day, there are private commercial property rights at stake here, and
Right.
and I have a hard time using the community wish list of things as an absolute. There's a line there.
To that point, that's not my argument. My argument is, is there a potential solution that can work within the vision that the community forged and towards obtaining the goals that Soul Centers is trying to obtain?
But when you talk about the community, you talk about it almost in absolute terms, and this is not an absolute.
No, that's correct.
And I think the community has given a lot of input, and we have come up, or at least the applicant has come up with, I think, a very viable solution that favors the pedestrian over the driver by just the configuration that they presented tonight. So I think they've covered a lot of what the community was concerned about. They've voiced that particular problem.
But there's a little bit of technicality there because the previous approach did not have much of a resistance as this one. So to your point, I think it's actually that they're rejecting this proposal as it stands more than they did any other approach.
Reading through the comments and skimming through them, the recurring themes were, we want Starbucks to stay in downtown and not move.
Right.
I get it,
that's
but
not the
that's
point.
also irrelevant.
Right, totally.
There were numerous
Yeah,
comments
nice-
like that
they're
that
nice
make
to have,
that
right.
make absolute perfect sense if I lived in the Kentlands and was a resident of the community. That totally get it, but they're also totally irrelevant to the discussion we're having.
And I totally get that. I just think that from the design standpoint, Main Street, it's a primary thoroughfare that it's going to be an A street. It's an entire frontage that they're not developing on the sketch plan that they've already gotten approved. Is that a plausible solution in which they could develop?
So let's take a step back, because you're on a track that's not about this application. But, but as a footnote, Kurt or Rob, just remind everybody the sketch plan that has been reviewed at what level for the future development. That's all. Just a quick.
It was a Z.
It's not
sketch
part of
plan.
the record. It's not part of. Just to clarify.
So again,
the overlapping approvals
some of the
there.
things, just again for context and to reaffirm some of the points that have been made. The original sketch plan was for all of the Kentlands, including this shopping center. It laid out the development rights. These plans, the shopping center, became vested upon construction, so therefore going backwards it vested the SDPs and the sketch plans. as discussed in the memo that Frank and I put together for the Planning Commission and the public and everybody else, what comes into play is the vested rights are in place. This is a shopping center, so any work being done in this area that builds upon the existing vested use is allowed, as long as there is no subdivision, and there's not. These pads are all built on that single block. So the master plan, the newest master plan, does not come into play. Sort of to Phil's point, because it's that, this is private property. You know, we have a master plan that is the policy of the city, but as I made very clear in that memo, the master plan does not obligate any property owner to implement that plan, no matter how many public processes it went through. It is still privately owned property. So with their design, you know, should they have, you know, moved over across Main Street and in a sense into the Kmart block, the former Kmart block, even if they didn't re-subdivide, this would still follow the same processes we're dealing with now, but it would have been a lot uglier because there is potentially a new sketch plan overlaying that. So again, they are looking at an area that had already previously received SDP approval for essentially the exact same application. The application has been amended to reflect current market conditions. So this is sort of how it is. We can discuss, you know, at any point, what if we put a pad site in the middle of the giant parking lot? All of that. That is not their desire. This is their property. They are building upon essentially what was previously approved and reflecting current conditions. And because these are vested plans that do not involve any subdivision, re-subdivision, they are bound by the previous sketch plan and the previous master plan.
And Rob, while I agree with you, I wasn't referring to the parking lot of Kmart. I'm referring to the Lowe's parking lot that faces Kmart. It's the same block that we're talking about. And I understand. I guess, you know, I know, sorry, to the soul, Brian, if you would indulge me and have you guys considered a study of that portion?
That's okay, it's fine. The question is, was there any other solution discussed or studied, and what was the
I
outcome?
guess if I understand, Brian Downey for the record, good evening. If I understand the question correctly, it would be in the portion of the parking lot between the existing Chipotle and
Correct.
the, essentially the front of Lowe's, the main entrance to Lowe's. I think if I put the question that way, it kind of answers itself.
Well,
I
just
mean,
if you would- I mean, the question was-
it's right in front of, we would not put, where we've located these buildings. I mean, if you're looking at where to put this stretch of buildings within this, call it block, the best place to put it in our estimation by far, and the only place to put it in our estimation by far, is where it is at the upper end of the Lowe's parking lot. To place it between the Chipotle and the garden center would be to put all of this immediately in front of the main entrance to Lowe's.
I think
And that
it's
would be
a-
functional, that would create an enormous amount of dysfunction. I wouldn't recommend that to any developer. And I don't mean to sort of really belittle the suggestion, but I want to just say how strongly I feel that that would not be, under the current circumstances, as an interim development, that just wouldn't be viable. So we, as a result, show it up at the top end of the parking lot.
Okay, that, just a clarification, that's not the main entrance of Lowe's, that's the main entrance to the garden center.
Sorry, it's right next to, it's immediately next to.
There's 2 lanes of
It's
traffic.
immediately next
Yeah.
to.
Yeah. All right. Any other?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to ask a question regarding safety, because we have this recurring safety issue with that roundabout that's adjacent to this proposal. And is there anyone who can maybe speak to the conclusions that were
Roundabout's
There's no
next block
roundabout.
down. This is a
This is
straight
a-
stop sign.
Across
Well,
intersection.
I said it's kind of adjacent. It's not that far. But my point is, there always seems to be an issue with it at this point. And I'm just wondering, when we looked at and I'm just asking the question, when the traffic study was done, was some of that taken into consideration? Because I think we need to look at it holistically. The impacts to the entire site. And I'm concerned about you know, the things that have come to us regarding the intersection, not the roundabout, I'm sorry, the intersection that's close to
Whole Foods.
Whole Foods,
Frozen.
right, and yeah. So, I mean, is there anyone can talk about the conclusions that are, and I know this was done in August of 2017, the conclusions in the traffic study. Was there any consideration given to some of the issues that are going on currently in this area? I'm not sure anyone can speak to it now, but
Look, how far did the traffic study reach? Did it go into the intersection?
I wouldn't be the person to answer that. I think there's
right. I think
somebody
it's
from
somebody
Wells that could
on the team, and I'm sorry to
clarify
put you
that.
on the spot there,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to know, because that safety is always a concern of ours. It's mine. I can speak for myself and maybe some others up here. So I just want to ask.
I'm Mike Warkowski. I'm
Okay.
with Wells and Associates. And we did the traffic report.
So on page 20.
So we looked at the intersections along Kentlands Boulevard. We looked at the Great Seneca Kentlands Boulevard intersection. And then going west along Kentlands Boulevard, we looked at the roundabout at Market Street.
Right.
Then the main, what we call the sort of the central driveway, if you will, and then further to the west, Main Street at the other roundabout. And then we also looked at the internal intersection.
And
where-
that's what I want to focus on, those where there's a four-way stop sign,
Right.
and then the roundabout that's a little further down. That, you know, that's given us some pause here.
So we looked at those intersections. We didn't have any capacity issues at any of the intersections you're talking about. We didn't look specifically at crash information at those locations. It wasn't identified as sort of a high crash location, but there were no apparent capacity issues out there, if that sort of speaks to your
So
question.
I guess the concern is, and I'm reading through the
Yeah.
Exhibit 41
Right.
internal circulation assessment. I totally believe that as far as cars are concerned. Okay, you know, great, we meet the
Right.
number of trips and the intersections are adequate, and don't have an issue with that. I think what the concern is for pedestrians.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I think there's sort of two issues here, not all of them necessarily related to your project. One is, I think there's an ongoing concern about the adequacy of pedestrian safety
Mhm.
in that area of the Kentlands, regardless of this project.
Right.
But, you know, with the increased trips that are gonna happen based on what we're all assuming is gonna be a relatively high volume drive-through, plus, you know, other things like that. You know, we have the exhibits that check the boxes for roadway adequacy and parking adequacy, but have there been studies of what the impacts are gonna be to
Right.
pedestrian safety at all of the intersections that are gonna be impacted by that?
Well, I mean, we look at the numbers of pedestrians at those intersections, and again, it wasn't identified as that we had a safety issue. I guess what I would say is that, you know, there's sort of a balance in the plan that does provide that connectivity along the new route, because you'll have a new sidewalk. And you only have one crossing in between there since the drive-through lane's been relocated. So from that perspective, as a pedestrian, you have a clearer path without what you have today, which is a whole lot of curb cuts along that
Yeah,
route.
so-
I mean, on that side of it, it's you're trying to balance, because on the other hand, you're also serving circulating traffic that is going into the shopping center along that route.
So, this is a question for staff. I mean, obviously, my understanding is that the main sort of road through Kentlands, where we've all been talking about pedestrian safety, is a city-owned, city-managed property. I don't think I have any concerns about the pedestrian safety and circulation on the Saul site. I think
Right.
we may be sort of veering off a little bit here, in that we're talking about concerns on a city-owned, city-maintained public facility. So, and maybe it's not. Maybe we don't want to confuse the two.
And I'd like to
And
remind
I'm not,
the
I
commission
didn't
and
want
the
to
public.
confuse, but I think it's important to talk about.
It is important, but there's much as our previous discussion, we are bound by the codes and regulations in place. And the methodology used for this traffic impact was reviewed by staff and was approved.
Okay.
That is the way it goes. We do not have pedestrian counts required in our traffic impact statements. However, to reiterate, as we all know, it has been approved, it is in the budget, we will be doing the review of Kentlands Boulevard. And a lot of the function of this city project is the function of the roundabouts, pedestrian safety, and lighting. Again,
Okay.
this comes to be a thing, and Phil was touching on it, because the project comes in, if it does not have a deleterious impact to the road, we cannot make them go further and begin doing more work on a public road that really is not impacted by their project. We don't have the legal authority to do that.
Yeah, and I wasn't really asking that, but I understand that. So,
And I think to frame this up appropriately, there is no data that suggests additional pedestrian traffic because of the new development. Right, wrong, or indifferent, there is in fact no data that actually captures that. We know that there's intersection issues with the pedestrian crossing
Yes.
that we feel are unsafe, and is queued up in the city's budget to do something about, regardless of this project. Right?
right.
The upside is at least now we have a walkway emerging on the
There you go.
On the other
northeast
yeah,
side,
right,
or
right.
Compass way that is,
Yeah.
that will then connect the pedestrians in a safer way, at least to the intersection. Whether or not the intersection itself is safe, that's something we're going to have to
And we're gonna have to really
get
look at,
to very
right.
quickly, because we'd like to get ahead of whatever ultimately
Right.
happens on this site and before that additional pedestrian
Right.
activity happens, because we want the pedestrian activity.
But
We want more people
I
crossing
want to
that street.
challenge us to look at and our new partners to look at it holistically. I mean, because I just don't want it to.
Well-
And maybe I'm wrong.
Well, we have
but-
that emerging also. I think I need to remind, or maybe staff can help us remind everyone that there is a sketch plan emerging for the larger center redevelopment
Okay.
in the
Right.
next phase.
Mhm.
Is that, you agree with that?
Well,
For Market Square, you're talking about, right?
No, I'm talking
No.
about the
Or the
other side.
Kentlands.
Yeah.
Kmart.
Kentlands Square,
Kmart.
Kmart
Right.
site, all of
Right.
that. There has been some discussion about what the next phase
Right.
might be. So that's where that happens, that holistic
Yeah.
look.
Well,
Unfortunately, you know.
You've also got to take into consideration mass transit. That may be in there as well. So
right. I mean,
So
I
let's,
think we're getting way ahead of
Yeah,
the
So
car.
let's
yeah,
get
way
back
ahead.
Yeah.
on
Okay.
the proposal. What else do we have of concern on the proposal itself?
I mean, this is actually not a concern. As far as the drive-through goes, you know, I think the revised plans go a whole long way to make it as palatable as it can be.
Correct.
I think it solves a number of problems. That, you know, just looking at it graphically, it increases the queuing space within the drive-through
Yeah.
itself. You know, the circulation is as good as I think you can get
Mhm.
for a drive-through. I mean, I understand the concerns about the sort of larger philosophical questions about a drive-through, but I think it solves the problems and it solves a lot of the concerns that we all were expressing previously.
Well, and I think, you know, again, to ask a question that'll need to happen at some point, I don't know if it applies to this application, but in terms of our discussion about compatibility, how many parking spaces does a drive-through replace? You know, honestly, if you're driving purchases and sales from visits to whatever store that ends up being, presumably in an ideal world, somebody parks and walks to 3 or 4 different locations. Realistically, they're often going to one location. So to the extent we can drive sales through there or offer plans that drive sales through there that don't require additional parking, that to me seems
It's a
like a
good
little bit
thing.
of a plus.
yep.
I think the one thing that I would, just in looking at the discussion that we started off this discussion with, and I maybe would suggest we make it a recommended condition to mayor and council, is the idea of streetscape improvements and when they happen. I agree with the logic that if they start at the site right adjacent to Chipotle, they don't necessarily have to do everything. But if the drive-through site is the first site, I think as part of that, we would want them to do the streetscape improvements. I don't like, personally,
Yeah,
I
I agree
don't
with
like the
that.
idea of having an island.
No,
You
I
know,
agree with that.
They can build these buildings in whichever order the market dictates. And if the market says the drive-through goes first, I think we need to do the streetscape.
No,
at
I
that time.
agree with that. I also think it's the more global issue that we've said all along, that we want to put pedestrian walkability, we want walkability to be the
To be
primary focus.
primary focus, right?
So as soon as a piece of dirt gets disturbed there, that is the first
That's
priority.
right.
So I don't see that there's a real value in waiting until building 2 happens. If you want to be surgical about it and make it a condition where it's, you know, if it's the building next to Chipotle, the first, whatever building that is, then maybe it can stop at the drive aisle for a while. But the reality is, one of the foundational pieces to this, to me, is to moving this forward, is that it solves a pedestrian connectivity issue, and that ought to be a priority in moving this forward.
Yeah, I mean, if
So I think I'm kind of moving towards where I think you're headed is, once it starts, that you go all out on the sidewalks. Now, one of the things that I guess, have to ask, and I won't ask the applicant to comment on it now, but for staff to be clear about is, there may be some economy issues with building all of that and then coming back and having to close up some of the drive aisles that will happen with those additional site developments. So that's the one thing I'm looking at that I don't know makes sense.
I'm not sure it's necessarily closing up.
Well, they are. They're closing up some of the drive aisles that are there now. So if you would say you had to finish all the way out to Kentlands Boulevard with the sidewalk, the pedestrian improvements, streetscape improvements, and then come back and infill that, but have accessible crosswalks, accessible curbs at each one of those current breaks, that might be one of those things that's a little bit extreme, but I don't know. I'm not sure how much impact that is.
I just gut feeling looking at it. I think there's some economically reasonable ways. We're talking about restriping parking lots. We're talking about some relatively minor.
Or just do it all now. Just go ahead and create the pads now, and not even wait.
Even if you did the sidewalk the whole way through,
Right.
okay, you got to redo some internal circulation in the
Right.
parking lot,
Right.
but
Would that revise condition number 2?
So we could. I don't know if you'd rather just revise it to say something to the effect that when they come in for the final site plan, they have to include a staging plan or something to show how they're going to address, the pedestrian, improving the pedestrian streetscape at the same time, as you pointed out, maintaining the parking lot circulation that might be there for a little while.
I would suggest a recommendation to council, something along the lines of, the commission feels strongly that pedestrian improvements are a priority from the time this project starts at, final site plan. If all sites are not being built simultaneously, the applicant shall provide a detailed plan and phasing for both construction and pedestrian improvements for review.
Yeah.
And that way it gives us a chance to pontificate on it at that time, but I think it needs to be clear
Right.
in
There will be
our
no
recommendation that we feel that's a priority.
Yeah.
I'll
That's
go
the
with that.
highest priority. So let's just be clear on our recommendation. I do want to get our discussion captured on the points that have been brought up for and against the plan. To be clear, we've seen both, mostly in the public testimony, a lot of those not for the plan. The first, I guess, flavor or theme that I saw and want to make sure we comment clearly on is the idea that this doesn't represent a comprehensive look at the shopping center for redevelopment.
Correct.
And I would be clear that we understand that, we know it, we're not overlooking that, but we also acknowledge that there's a good plan in place for the current shopping center that vests rights for this. And we fully intend to respect the legal position of the applicant and the process that we've endorsed consistently in the city. We don't try to undermine legal site plans. There may be jurisdictions that do, but that wouldn't be in keeping with our charge to be this is the quasi judicial role. This is not the advisory role. This is the quasi judicial role of the planning commission. So I want to make sure that's clear. Is that any problems with that?
Fine.
No. And the basic idea that this complies largely with the existing sketch plan, so there wasn't need to reopen that. The second, I think, big theme, as we've all stated very clearly, is the drive-through and whether that's appropriate for the development. And I think we need to be very clear that it's a split opinion in a way. There are good arguments to be made both sides. Certainly to the extent that you don't want to promote car-based, many more car trips. There's an upside to acknowledging market demand for it and allowing it to happen while not compromising directing the development to support walkability and pedestrian scale and streetscapes and safety, which I think they've done a good job. And the footnote is, I think we ought to keep an eye on stuff like this as a potential guideline for how we resolve this conflict in the future, because I think
That's a
it's
good
an ongoing
point.
it's an ongoing issue. What else should we add to the drive-through discussion?
I think that captures it.
All right. So we had the global theme, we have the drive-through theme, and then we have
The streetscape.
streetscape theme, and by blocking, and frankly, again, as a planning strategy, they blocked some of the access points to the parking lot, which creates better continuity for the sidewalk and streetscape
Absolutely.
all in there. So I don't see a lot wrong with that. I think the only thing outstanding, the only outlier, is the idea of a single-use building, what otherwise is an MXD intended development area, but it's a shopping center already, as we kind of go back to the original point, which is it was approved that way. And in another place and time, and hopefully not too distant future, we'll see a more rich, diverse, or more rich mixed use there, and that'll be part of that, I think, other phase. Because as it's been presented by both the applicant and staff, this is in fact an interim development step,
Yes.
which I don't want to argue about the 2008 master plan. I know where it was headed. But I do believe there was language acknowledging that things happen in between,
Mm-hmm.
in interim ways. And who knows? It may be the test case for how things are altered a little bit in the future. We'll see.
But, to that point, I think that's the source of all the points that I've seen raised for this development, is that Beatty built Market Square on the same premise, and now Kimco is investing
Right.
in refacading the 10-year-old buildings that were going to be torn down.
20, but yeah.
Yeah, so I think that we have to, I think to throw the fact that this is an interim condition, it to me is the most upsetting, I guess.
It is, yeah. But it's also a fact of life that the
Absolutely,
these
and I
buildings,
totally get that. I'm just, it's
these moneymakers could they
And it could be the
absolutely-
economic locomotive that spurs on the
Hopefully,
development you want to see
Right.
ultimately, so
Right.
The
let's
rea-
go with that aspect.
The reality is
Yeah.
that every building's an interim condition. I mean, if you want to take it to an extreme, every building's an interim condition, so
Yeah,
Yeah.
for 40 years,
Mhm.
right.
depends on what, depends
the
on your
best-
time
The
horizon.
best we could hope are these could be wildly successful independent businesses and individual buildings, and they become a real
True.
focus for the
True.
neighborhood.
That's it.
And that's what we hope for, and will spur more development in the area,
Yes.
because it'll draw more people there. And now you can get your coffee while you load up on 2x4s.
And it could spur.
Which is an interesting point to make, perspective also, I think, is the idea of drive-through in a shopping center, where you already are promoting and encouraging cars to go. It's not as if
Yeah.
we're creating a
Right.
strip center out on
Yeah.
this is frankly a shopping center that needs cars. It has a big parking field, it's large purchases, it's not.
We want people to come to it.
Yeah, so it sort of has some consistency and compatibility there that some sites wouldn't. If somebody were looking at a site in a more compact
And I
area.
agree. I think if we were to look at it holistically at the downtown, that is the place. But again, if you look at Gaithersburg, there's plenty of other places to have that type of development. But
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just.
So, any other points we should amplify? Now, it's only a recommendation, so we're voting
Yes.
to either
Recommend.
move this forward as a recommendation with those two conditions. Any other conditions you all want to see, or any other considerations you want the council to make?
Phil, do you want to make that the third condition that you?
Yeah, I mean, I would edit condition,
Replaces.
Condition two.
replace condition 2.
Okay.
If you want me to restate it.
Kirk, do you think you have the
Can
intent of that?
can you,
Yeah, I have the basics
Pick
of
it
it. I
out.
know
Yeah.
Miriam's definitely taking notes, so we'll be able to get the final thing. It was basically to the effect that, as part of any final site plan application, that the applicant has to include a phasing plan showing the pedestrian and parking reconfiguration.
Yeah.
Or pedestrian improvements and streetscape improvements and the parking reconfiguration.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is
For
that is correct, but I think the sentence that needs to go before that, when our recommendation is provided to the council, is that our commission feels strongly that the pedestrian improvements must be prioritized in any construction phasing, and cannot be done piecemeal.
Is the applicant okay with that? Can we,
I,
is the applicant?
We're not on the record, we can't
Oh,
do
sorry.
that. We're
And-
making a
and-
recommendation, they
and-
can
Right.
certainly.
and
Yeah,
frank-
they
and-
could- yeah.
and not to be glib, but I'm not sure it matters.
right, no,
I mean, we have an.
We have a recommendation,
In
right.
all of this discussion, if we have an obligation to do anything, it's to make sure stuff like that gets
Yeah.
in
And-
there as a requirement.
right.
Council can weigh in on
Yeah.
whether they want to approve it or
And
not.
if we're wrong, we'll be corrected.
Okay,
All right, so
Not that we
is
want
that,
to be wrong.
Kirk, is that good for
Mhm.
that modification?
Yep.
So if this goes where I think it's going, we're gonna make a motion with the two conditions and as amended, is that good enough for you?
Mhm.
okay.
Good enough for you?
Yep.
Okay. Any other points we need to get in
Hmm.
the therefores and the here-tos and the as-withs at the front? Anything else?
Nope.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Well, then we're ready for a motion, please, on the recommendation.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the planning commission recommend to the mayor and city council, based on the evidence and testimony submitted into the record and the findings presented herein, recommend approval of Schematic Development Plan SDP 7712-2017 with the 2 conditions as revised in the record.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Okay, so we've got any abstentions? Okay. So 4-0-1 on the vote tonight. All right, thank you very much.
4-1-0.
4-1-0. 4-1-0.
Yay, nay, and then abstentions.
Got it, I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you all very much. Good luck. Just, when is the mayor and council's hearing?
So the mayor and council's record will close on, it's a Tuesday. I believe the date is April 3rd, but don't quote me on that.
Okay.
It's at 5 p.m.
I believe you're correct, yes.
Okay. And the actual policy discussion will take place on Monday, April 16th at 7:30 at City Hall.
Okay.
Well, probably later in the, it's later in the
That's
day.
what,
So if there's any more opinions or any more input, the record's open for the
The council
mayor and
record is
council
still
until
open,
April
correct.
3rd.
Until April 3rd.
All right, thanks very much, all. Next we go to from the commission. Phil, can I start with you tonight, please?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I have, and it's just something that may be worth doing a little research on the staff side. I think we touched on the idea of pedestrian improvements being required as part of a development application. It doesn't sound, and correct, I may be wrong, but it doesn't sound like we have a sort of comprehensive policy for developers. Obviously there's a traffic study requirement, and if an intersection doesn't meet the traffic requirement, developers are required to fund the necessary improvements.
So take that a little farther.
So where I'm going with this is, I think it's worth doing a little bit of research as to how other jurisdictions have addressed the issue of pedestrian facility adequacy off-site.
Off-site, okay.
And whether, I know for a fact Montgomery County has adopted some recent things, mainly focused in Bethesda and mainly focused on ADA, where they're
Right.
requiring developers to jump through what are frankly some absurd hoops in regards to improving public facilities for pedestrians as part of development. I think it'd be interesting to look at, outside of Montgomery County, are there examples of sort of good balanced municipal ordinances that strike a good balance between not overburdening developers, but making
Right.
sure that pedestrian safety and pedestrian facility improvements adjacent to sites are done in a reasonable way.
Yeah, when you said that, it occurred to me that, traffic studies will do the whole traffic shed diagram. So they'll look 5 miles up the road to see where the real generators are and how they're getting to the site.
Yeah.
Again, it's off-site relative to improvements, but it has some relevance in terms of understanding what other impacts are happening. Pedestrians ought to get that way in the city.
Yeah.
I mean, actually, we ought to be there where we're understanding that once you put something here, where are folks actually going to walk from to get there?
And I mean,
Make sure that-
Pedestrians and bikes, I think that, that's the way
And
that
bikes,
we're
sure.
moving with complete streets. We
Yeah.
have to consider the entire movement.
And there's, I think traffic is sort of an accepted thing because municipalities have been doing it for a while, putting that burden on developers as part of development. I think pedestrian facilities may be a little bit of a, I think that idea is going to take some time for everyone in the development community to get used to, because it's a slightly different animal, and it's not something that has been traditionally looked
Yeah, and
at.
it occurs to me too, we've also looked at transit stops in that same context, where when something is being developed, you want to understand how close the transit stops are for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily on site, right?
Yeah.
It's somewhere nearby that they need to begin to develop a relationship with either the county or the city metro
Yeah.
in general. But the point is that it's not unreasonable to look off-site for some of the things that will serve the site, and we just probably need to add that dimension.
And it's more than just a dashed line on a plan saying you're within a 5-minute walk radius of
Right,
the
it's
site.
no pathways, or
it's
it's
the
actual.
how.
Yeah, it's the pathways.
So I think
It's
it's worth looking at that and for how we can build
Where
that
would
in.
that fall? We got master plan elements coming up. Where might that fall? Transportation?
We could look at it under transportation. I would say, on a case-by-case basis, we do look at, obviously, on-site circulation and improvements on a site plan, especially retrofits to an existing building for ADA purposes. Off-site improvements, I would just be wary we can't impose exactions on an applicant from the state of Maryland, obviously, so you can't make them build necessarily a new bus station.
Yeah, but for example, the county, Montgomery County right now has a regulation, and I believe it's specific to Bethesda, that anybody doing development as part of any sketch or SDP plan in the city of Bethesda, a developer must survey all sidewalks within 500 feet of a property line and make improvements. Now, everybody's fighting that because it's an absolutely not well thought out requirement, but it's a requirement. So that sort of thing has passed muster, at least for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, until it's challenged.
Until it's challenged, which it likely will be.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think there should be a way to do something that's reasonable.
Well,
You know, we're talking
certainly in
about
staff
crosswalks.
review, if we amped up the awareness of what this looks like at a staff review level, that the question comes up, that call it a radius, call it a pathway, something that actually acknowledges this is a plus up of something for pedestrians, and we need to understand how they're going to get there safely.
And frankly, the answer may be, you know, I'm not proposing that I know the answer. The answer may be that the city needs to program budgets for an applicant doing a study and the city doing the improvements if it's public right away. I have no idea. My point is we should study it and find out what the best practices are.
I think it feels a little bit like what might be part of the master plan updates, where you're looking at some of the impact.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I think that, you know, for when we look at each application, it could be done on the individual basis and require as a, you know, a pedestrian shed of X amount. I think it, I love the idea. I think, you know, to encourage people to invest in that pedestrian quality is frankly an investment that is bound to return.
And especially when you consider, if you're talking dollars and cents, you compare the cost of upgrading some sidewalks and some crosswalks to, you know, redoing an intersection, we're talking pennies on the dollar.
Yeah.
We can definitely look into it. I mean, we'll obviously work with the city's legal department on how far we can go with some of this, obviously.
Well, I tell you what, before it
and we'll
turns
look and see what Montgomery County's doing as well.
Yeah, do that, and before it turns into policy and whatever legal issues are, look at, if you would please, where in the development process this could really effectively be done.
That's a good point.
You know, is it your design review state, and it's one of the things on the checklist? Is it, you know, something we just include in the staff report as a narrative, and then we talk about it ad hoc? You know, see where that really belongs, that kind of stuff. Again, based on what you find out from the county or some other jurisdictions. Very good. Thanks, Bill. Anything else?
Nope.
Oh, Danny.
Nothing tonight.
All right, Lloyd.
Just want to recommend, if you haven't seen it, there's a very good presentation made for the city council and the planning commissioners on Monday of this week on the revision of typology of streets and roadways and intersections. And it's something, obviously, that's of great concern here to the commissioners here.
Absolutely.
We've talked about extensively, and I think there's going to be some real positive movements in the future looking at those issues. And I think there's also a hearing coming up on capital planning budget that's coming up sometime in April with the city council. And I will be present there to make some recommendations specifically on Kentlands Boulevard to encourage them to proceed with the improvements there. And if there are any other intersections within the city that people feel strongly about, please come out and visit the council meeting and make your recommendations. And hopefully they'll act on them.
Excellent point. What was the date of that again for the capital?
I think that's
Actually, budget. It's a budget hearing.
Yeah, it's budget.
It's coming up in April, right?
Yeah, I'll come
Okay.
up with a specific date. Just a second.
Rosalie, anything?
Nothing.
No? Let me just, a couple quick things. Frank, maybe you know, or Greg, there was a lot of flurry of activity around the cell tower legislation that had been brought up for the state.
Yes.
And then it was canceled. At least the hearing was.
At the Senate level, the sponsor was the chair of the Finance Committee, and the Finance Committee was holding the hearing, and the sponsor decided, you know what, we're essentially not going to proceed with this year. He had gotten word with a lot of input that many of the local governments are working very directly with the providers and those who are making proposals.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, there may not be any bill at all, but it'll be something that will be a continuing discussion. It doesn't mean it won't be coming up in another year. It doesn't mean at some point we may not end up with a they were talking about a study group over the summer or
Okay.
something like that.
But for now, there's nothing pending in for the foreseeable future.
There was still the House bill, but with that would have to go through the same committee in the
Right,
Senate.
Right.
It has to pass both houses, so it does not look likely that there would be any action this
Okay.
year.
By the way, the budget meetings are on April the 16th.
Okay.
Just-
No. And then I was gonna close with kind of following up this discussion we had on the specific application about drive-throughs, but for a long time we've had a very squishy policy about drive-throughs. It's no but on a lot of applications, and frankly, from my observation, I don't have specific data, but it appears that it's been mostly biased against fast food drive-throughs. Okay, fair enough. There you are, because we've seen obviously new buildings for banks that have drive-throughs for pharmacies.
Yeah.
So clearly there's a use in play there that kind of drove some of those decisions. And again, anecdotally and just by observation, I know developers have asked if they could do drive-through restaurants, and they're being told no. So, that's fine. I'm not arguing that. But what I am imagining needs to be taught again about, and this is probably a master plan, if not an actual zoning question, is what is the criteria going to be? Because I don't want to see another application like this one where we have to kind of make up what criteria we're gonna judge this on. You know, we either need a zoning regulation that clearly and specifically limits use of drive-throughs to or drive-throughs to certain uses, or some other criteria we can use to make the decision to encourage or promote a plan or not. Because it's not going to be good enough to say that the city doesn't like drive-throughs if we're in fact allowing them for certain types of businesses. And it's not going to be good enough to look at a plan that gets pretty creative about how to preserve the higher objectives of things like pedestrian access and all, and not approve it if it sort of follows the tenets of putting service drives in the back of buildings. I mean, there are all kinds of ways to spell this out, but what I'm really, I think, asking for, let's get on top of this once and for all and figure out what drive-throughs mean and what we can do to shape the criteria for us to look at the applications when they come in. It'll also save applicants a few steps too, right? I mean, if we can be clear about what we're looking for and why, they can either solve for it or walk away from the site. But does that make sense? Is that?
Yeah. It does.
I don't know what that
Can
looks
we-
like in terms of.
Can we do that?
I mean, right now, as you know, we don't have drive-throughs as a use
Right.
category. They're kind of accessory to the
Right.
restaurant, let's say,
Mhm.
as the use category. We can look into it a little further and see how other jurisdictions are handling it. Like I said, I think Montgomery County has it as a use in their zoning ordinance, and I think they do them with special exceptions in that case and have them yearly inspected.
But you have
I don't
drive-throughs
know if
and
that's
also,
necessarily where we want to go with it, but I'm just,
I don't know either where it needs to go specifically. What I'm suggesting is that we get something codified around it, because I don't think we have that.
yeah, you're right, we don't.
And I'm worried that as we move into these kind of emerging markets of new kinds of retail
Right.
that begin to really blend, you know, what you do in your car and what you don't, you know, what you get out of the car to do, and the potential for even, you know, bikes to drive through, bikes to pull up to a window. I don't know. I mean, it just there needs to be a way to start
That's a
shaping
good
this that
point.
makes some sense. Because I do know that with this application moving forward, there's going to be a lot of raised eyebrows about whatever happened to limiting drive-throughs.
well, restaurants these days are also having, I mean, formal restaurants now have drive-up windows. Is that a
Or at
drive-through?
least curb service.
Curb
yeah.
service, yeah,
Mhm.
that's becoming a new.
Well, we know else with the change of restaurants too, like Uber, for example, and other they're having their own pickup and delivery service.
Right.
Grubhub, yeah.
So they're providing pickup windows for those type of
Right.
services.
Great point. Yeah. So,
So I think
yeah,
there is a change in the
that's-
market, and it's something we definitely
Right.
can look into.
Yeah, I think.
But I mean, there's also a context to that, and I think that's what it's hope to address. I think that, you know, there's a density associated to those places, and I think that, you know, it's what priority are we assigning to a specific location?
Mhm.
Is it pedestrian or is it vehicular? And I think we have to. There's a lot of variables that we need to consider when we're
Yeah, and my fear is that, not my fear, but my
Addressing or
hunch is that a good
creating
designer.
a category.
Yeah, my hunch is that a good designer can actually commingle those uses
Yeah.
successfully. And when you think about it, we talk about multimodal transportation, cars, bikes, pedestrians, and ways to do complete streets to accommodate all of them. why then is our commercial infrastructure not also, at least acknowledging those three layers also? It's a very interesting kind of conflict for me right now. So I think let's get some work done on figuring out if we can't wrap a little bit of framework around it. I think it's fine if a consensus emerges that we're not going to do it in certain districts or certain zones without a special exception or something, something more onerous than just a checklist. That's okay. I mean, I'm not even advocating for a certain outcome. I just think we ought to be organized and be disciplined about what those criteria are.
Yeah, I think this discussion has also brought me to a different point, even though I didn't have a comment. And it's considering the idea of having expirations assigned to sketch plans. And I think that, this is something that would have addressed the vision of the community without any contention.
Right.
Should we have, and I mean, that doesn't preclude the applicant to continue to apply for not an exception, to extend the permit or to revisit the idea.
Right.
But if there would if in '89 there would have been assigned a 30-year expiration date, then we would be having a very different discussion.
I think academically what they would tell you is that it's like zoning. Once an area is zoned, you can't rezone it without the property agreeing to.
But if it's done from the beginning, if there's an expectation, we have some applications coming up with sketch plans, I think it is an understandable and.
I think it's a good point. And maybe Greg gets on a little different track, but get behind a little bit some of these vested sketch plan scenarios and whether or not we could put a term on them.
And I think it's worth checking, and I'm searching my memory without having it in front of me. I'm going through this on a project in my professional life with the county, and there are, I can't remember whether it's at sketch or whether it's at site plan, but there are periods from approval, and it's 36 or 72 months. If you don't move to the next step, you got to go back.
Start over.
We have obviously final site plans, 2 years, they expire out. SDPs and sketch plans, they don't have an expiration date on them.
I believe at the county level they do.
And the reason why we've always never had them, obviously, is development takes time, especially when you have a bubble plan. It could be 20 years out before that really gets envisioned, especially if it's a large project that's built over many phases.
But that could also be used in the other argument to encourage that whatever, basically, to encourage any developer to be intentful about whatever the work they're trying to get move forward, and to make sure that the time that both the city and the developer spent is immediately implemented.
Well, and I think in the MXD, it's particularly interesting for MXD because there's a little bit of a conflict between a sketch plan and then what's required at SDP, because the SDP doesn't take it much further, or doesn't need to take it much further than a sketch plan, frankly. I mean, it's the same kind of diagrammatic thing. So whether they're both needed or one, like you said, one has a term, or they both have a term, but one's longer than the other or something. I think we have to, again, it's something to look at, because if we're saddled with sketch plans that ultimately become obsolete because of the planning strategies that are emerging in our city, that shouldn't be trumped by something that just happens to not have term to it,
I mean,
and even, I'm sorry, Greg, even as the market evolves and the trends change, I think it behooves us as a city to retain a certain amount of control about what happens in the future.
I was just going to say, I mean, on an SDP, I mean, as the commission, you do have the ability to recommend a condition to the council on an SDP to have it term out.
Well, no, but at sketch plan we don't.
Even a sketch plan, you still make a recommendation to the council.
So they can term it out as part of their.
If the council wish to accept that condition, ultimately on obviously a sketch and an SDP, it comes down to this council's approval of the plan.
So
but as you guys' recommendation, you do have the authority to make. I mean, you have the ability to make a recommendation, and that hey, we want to recommend this expires out in 5 years.
Which is what happened previously.
It's a little different than what happened with this application we're talking about now, but yeah. I mean, this application had a condition that said it needed to come back for further review within a certain time frame. It wasn't constructed.
Okay. Well, maybe we're there. Maybe we need to start looking at that. At least as a, again, another way to kind of organize and be a little more disciplined about how this is moving forward. I mean, at this point, would you even know, is there a way to poll the system and know what approved sketch plans are out there that haven't moved to the next phase yet? Is there any real inventory of that?
I mean, we track obviously all our site plans. Off the top of my head, I don't
I'm
think I
saying,
know
is
which
there-
ones are completely
No, you wouldn't
built
have
out.
I just wonder, is there a record of that somewhere that could be assembled?
No.
You just wait for them to pop back up again because an owner, a property owner has
I'm
it.
familiar with the ones I've worked on recently, but, but no, I don't, we don't have a record.
The reason I'm
of
saying
all
is,
of
I don't
them.
know whether it's a big problem that's lurking, or if it's just a one or two isolated incidents. This happened to be one, and there may be another couple, but the policy moving forward might be to be a little bit more.
My
more
gut would tell
finite
me
about it.
that it's probably an isolated incident. I mean, most people are going to move forward with their sketch and SDP within a reasonable time frame. I mean, there's market conditions that are going to come into
Sure.
play with anything.
Sure.
So I mean, yeah, could there be an sketch, an SDP out there that never went forward because there was a recession? Yes.
Yeah, and we've seen those.
But I think, it's just, I don't know, good type of practice to keep, there's so many scenarios that can happen to it within a development that we cannot control, that could hinder it from developing and sitting, or just, I think that it behooves us to retain a level of control that allows us to have a say in the future.
Fair enough. So a couple of legislative tracks together. Okay, that's good. Thank you. All right. Anything? Let's see. Greg, did you?
Just a reminder, again, the Kimco Market Square joint public hearing on their sketch plan is April 16th, and then our next meeting is April 4th.
So you got the budget meeting and the Kimco on the same day? The 16th,
Yes.
okay.
All right. Good.
Makes life easier.
Okay.
Be here.
Frank, Miriam, anything? Trudy, thanks for sticking around. Anything tonight? All right. If there isn't anything else, have a good evening. We're adjourned.